The name Jeffrey Dahmer entered the lexicon of American serial killers in the summer of 1991. His reign of terror ended on the 22nd of July when a young man who'd been lured inside Dahmer's apartment survived. His name was Tracy Edwards.
I had my head turned like this looking at the fish tank, and before I know it, he threw a handcuff on me and had a big blade up under my heart, telling me if I don't do what he says, he's gonna kill me,
Edwards had managed to free himself and, still handcuffed, runs from the building, where he flags down a police car. Officers return to the apartments with him. As they enter, nothing prepared them for its gruesome contents. In the refrigerator, a human head. Nearby, in a freezer, 3 more heads and a decapitated body. Down the hall, in a closet, police find 2 skulls. There is also a large pot containing hands and male genitals. And most horrifying of all, police discover this 57-gallon industrial drum. In it are 3 bodies decomposing in acid.
We have, at this time, established there are 11 bodies, victims that we feel that were recovered from the apartment. These consist of intact skeletons and body parts of 5 individuals with partial body parts of the remaining.
To imagine that any human being, any civilized human being in civilized society could do something as gruesome. Other than that, it's inexplicable.
You never think the man next door would be a murderer. And especially something like this where he cutting up people, this is unbelievable.
The fumes was coming up under the door and I knew something. I thought it was some dead goldfish.
The police arrest Jeffrey Dahmer, a 31-year-old worker in a chocolate factory. The arrest shocks Gerald Boyle, who had represented Dahmer in an earlier criminal case, a case with tragic links to the murders.
And when they told me they had taken 11 skulls or 10 skulls out of his apartment, it was as if I was on candid camera. It wasn't believable. Because he was just a passive, wimpy human being.
Shortly after the arrest, Dahmer's father, Lionel, phones his son's apartment.
Jeff had not contacted my mother for a while. He always checked in with her, like every other day. And he hadn't checked in for about 4 days. So called him at his apartment, and this man answered. And he just said, "Jeff isn't here right now." And I said, "Well, who is this?" And he identified himself as an officer. And he said that a detective would call me back later, that there had been a homicide. It really didn't hit me real hard that Jeff was the center of the investigation, the absolute center, until I got all of this information in detail. I didn't know how to deal with it. I was just paralyzed, sitting at my desk, trying to figure out what to do.
Jeffrey Dahmer cooperates fully with police from the moment he's arrested. For the next 4 weeks, he sits smoking, drinking soda and coffee as he confesses in minute detail to a total of 17 murders dating back 13 years to 1978.
It was cathartic for him. I mean, he wanted to unload right from the very beginning.
In his 148-page statement, Dahmer confesses to acts of unimaginable horror: necrophilia, cannibalism, dismemberment, and murder.
I met with him a couple of times at the prison in Milwaukee. The first time I was there, I hugged him, and he said something like, "I really fouled up this time." You know, understatement of the century.
God sends us heavy to the family of Tony Hughes, to the city of Milwaukee, to so many other mothers and
fathers. As the victims are buried, an outraged community demands to know how so many men can have disappeared and the police have failed to notice. Was it because Dahmer was white and his victims mainly from ethnic minorities and gay.
We are dealing with lives that has been perished due to misconduct. I mean, this could have been stopped.
They were racist and homophobic. This city will do absolutely everything within it.
7 months after his arrest, Dahmer's trial begins. Among the spectators are the victims' families and his father, Lionel Dahmer, along with his second wife, Cherie. Jeffrey Dahmer has confessed and pleads guilty to the murders, one in his father's house, one in a hotel, 3 at his grandmother's house, and 12 in his apartment. The state of Wisconsin does not have the death penalty. What the court must decide is whether Dahmer should be sent to prison or to a mental hospital. In short, was Dahmer sane at the time of the murders? Was he so mentally ill that he could not control his behavior? Or were the killings a series of premeditated acts? Both the defense and the prosecution call experts who spend hours examining and evaluating Dahmer. It will be these experts who guide the jury into the mind of a murderer. And to do this, they must revisit Dahmer's life and crimes.
When I first shook his hand, there was no firmness to his grip. It was just very limp.
Among others, the defense will call Dr. Fred Berlin, an expert in the treatment of sex offenders.
When I was talking to him, it was like talking to the guy next door. There was no sense of someone who was menacing or in any way dangerous.
Forensic psychiatrist and criminologist Dr. Park Dietz will be called by the prosecution. Dietz has evaluated thousands of offenders and testified in hundreds of trials.
I actually like Jeffrey Dahmer. He's somebody whom I enjoyed interviewing because he was as curious about why he had done these things as I was.
Dahmer's curiosity will lead him to talk in detail about how he did it.
I went to bathhouses, I went to bars, shopping malls.
Mostly, he hunts for victims at closing time in the gay bars of Milwaukee.
Their sexual preference didn't matter to me. Their race didn't matter to me. The first 2 young men were white. The 3rd young man was American Indian. The 4th and 5th were Hispanic. It was just their looks.
He goes for men in their late teens to mid-20s, of medium height, with slender builds and smooth skin.
If he didn't find them attractive enough, he let them go. Only those whom he wanted to have stay with him longer became candidates for being disabled or killed.
And for those, the pattern will always be the same.
Dahmer selectively took his victims on weekends so that he would have time to enjoy them.
Dahmer asks his victims if they would like to make some money posing for photographs. They return to his apartment by taxi or bus. Once inside, Dahmer photographs his victims, sometimes posing them in handcuffs as a way to restrain them. They have what he calls light sex, kissing, fondling, oral sex, and masturbation.
Typical serial killer is an organized, sadistic, sexually oriented killer.
Robert Resler is an author in criminology who coined the term serial killer during his 20-year career in the FBI, where he pioneered criminal profiling. He, too, interviews Dahmer.
Dahmer had a sexual interest, but he was not sadistic.
Jeffrey Dahmer offers his victims a drink laced with ground-up pills that he prepares before going out.
He was drugging his victims, inducing unconsciousness by putting a sleeping drug into their drinks to get them unconscious, where he would sexually assault while unconscious.
I'm thinking how to phrase this carefully because I don't want to make it seem, well, gee, he didn't make them suffer, that's okay. Obviously it's not. But he was able to say, at least, thank God, if I didn't know how to stop this, I didn't cause agony and suffering to people in the midst of their dying.
Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer starts to experiment, giving his drugged victims makeshift lobotomies in an attempt to create sex slaves.
He started drilling holes in the heads of his victims, putting acid into their brain cavities in an attempt to kill their intellect, keep their bodies alive, keep themselves nourished, and then keep them around. He said if he could attain that, he wouldn't have to kill anymore.
There was a big element of wanting complete control over someone, total control, not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted, and that was a big part of it. Lust played a big part of it, controlling lust.
If the lobotomies don't kill them, he does. He has sex with the corpses, cutting open the bodies.
Dahmer said that just the colors of the internal organs and the glistening, the warm, moist, glistening colors, I mean, he just went into all the detail, and he was very enamored with that. I mean, he was attracted to that aspect, the disemboweling of a human being.
One thing led to another. It took more and more deviant type behaviors to satisfy my urges, and so it just spiraled out of control.
Dahmer begins to cook and eat his victims.
That was another step. It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me. Besides the just mere curiosity of what it would be like, it made them feel that they were a part of me, and it gave me a sexual satisfaction to do that.
He starts keeping the skulls and bones.
I started saving the skeletons and preserving other parts.
The purpose is to construct an altar made from the remains of his victims, a shrine that can tap into their energy and give him power.
And the whole idea of his setting up a temple-like scenario with the table with skulls on it and the skeletons nearby was that he wanted to try to create a powerful scene where just by sitting there, he'd be able to feel some mastery, some power, some significance.
Dahmer was a person that couldn't get himself on track in life. He had no particular education. He had no job of any particular importance. He had very low esteem.
You know what his power was? To be a real estate salesman. That's what he wanted to do, help become somebody different. He wanted to sell real estate.
What emerges is that signs of Dahmer's killing started in childhood.
I feel it's wrong for people who commit crimes to try to shift the blame onto somebody else, onto their parents or onto their upbringing or living circumstances. I think that's just a cop-out. I take full responsibility.
Most that come out that are serial killers have been introduced to violence as children and have been viciously, physically beaten and often sexually exploited. None of that could be uncovered in Dahmer's background.
So how did Jeffrey Dahmer become one of the world's most notorious serial killers? According to his father, the pregnancy had been difficult for his wife Joyce. Lionel Dahmer says she suffered from depression during the pregnancy.
She was taking quite a few different types of medication and many pills of the same type of medication, a lot of pills at the time, just before Jeff was born, in the last trimester. And while I was trying to search every possible reason why Jeff turned out the way he did, one of the things that crossed my mind, of course, was the effect of biochemicals on the brain, and especially just before birth.
Joyce Dahmer remembers it differently.
I don't know what medications were prescribed, and I had a doctor, a physician. I took the medicine that was prescribed for me, and for the most part I was healthy. There was nothing that was out of the ordinary as far as my pregnancy was concerned.
Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer is born on the 21st of May, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the eldest of Lionel and Joyce's two sons.
He was a very bubbly little child. And he loved to wrestle and to be lifted up and played with a lot. And he ran to greet his mother and father and grandma and grandpa, and was very exuberant as a very young child.
But even then, life is far from perfect in the Dahmer house. Dahmer later tells investigators that his mother continued to suffer from depression and his father was frequently absent. Around this time, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, notices what he calls the inner darkening of his son as Jeff's personality begins to change.
At about 6 or 7, when we moved from Ames, Iowa to Doylestown, and he just became more withdrawn and shy, and I don't know that it was a turning point for anything other than that. It was just not as socially in tune, and it was extremely shy.
At 14, Jeffrey Dahmer realizes he's homosexual, but he's also tormented by dark thoughts.
Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't. I just kept it all inside.
At 15, he starts to collect and dissect dead animals he finds by the roadside, aroused by the glistening innards.
I also learned from him that he'd been particularly fascinated the first time he saw pieces of a human corpse, which was on a field trip in high school, and he had let the rest of the class wander away while he stood there mesmerized by this.
Somewhere, Jeffrey Dahmer's sexual urges mingle with violent fantasies of killing and dismemberment. Around the same time, Dahmer begins to fantasize about a jogger he sees in the neighborhood. Several times he waits in the bushes with a baseball bat, planning to attack the jogger and have sex with him while the man is unconscious. But the jogger fails to appear.
I don't think that you go to your mother or father and say, I'm having a little problem, Mom and Dad. I'm thinking of tying somebody up and making love to them. Who do you discuss that with?
Not with his parents, who are arguing constantly as their marriage falls apart. Dahmer later tells investigators that at 17 he starts to drink heavily, a pattern that continues in the years to come. By 1978, Joyce and Lionel Dahmer are divorcing. Lionel moves out of the house, and Joyce takes their other son and moves to Wisconsin, leaving Jeffrey, then 18 and soon to start college, alone in the house. It is here that he commits his first murder. Later he recalls it for police in great detail, because he says, "You don't forget your first one." It is early evening when Dahmer sees Stephen Hicks hitchhiking on a road near his house.
I wish I just kept on going, but I didn't. Turned around, picked him up, and that's when the nightmare became a reality.
They go to Dahmer's house.
We talked, had some drinks. I knocked him out. That was the first time.
Later that night, he dismembers the body and puts it into rubbish bags. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he puts the bags in his car and is about to dump them when he's stopped by the police for driving over the center line. When asked about the bags, he says they contain rubbish he'd forgotten to take to the dump. police don't check the bags. Dahmer returns home with the body and later crushes the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering them in the woods by his house. It is here, more than a decade later, that the police will find the remains. In 1979, after a term in college, Dahmer joins the army, but is discharged in 1981 due to alcohol abuse. Shortly after this, he moves in with his grandmother.
Went through a period when he was with his grandmother of religious commitment, where he knew what his difficulties were, and was a Bible reader.
But even prayer doesn't stop the urges. In 1982, he is convicted of disorderly conduct after being caught exposing himself to teenage boys. Dahmer claims that for the next several years, he tries to ignore his fantasies of sex and mutilation. When the urges are strong, he uses a male mannequin to simulate homosexual encounters until his grandmother discovers it in his wardrobe. But his necrophiliac urges keep getting stronger. In 1985, he starts going to bathhouses where he drugs his partners and has sex with them while they're unconscious. He also reads obituaries to trace dead bodies. He even gate crashes a wake and is so attracted to the corpse that he sneaks into the cemetery to dig up the grave. Dahmer is defeated by the frozen ground. But this is only the beginning.
He made a conscious decision. I will no longer resist my evil impulses. I will yield to them. And after that, there was no God, either a divinity or a law that controlled the man. He became a law unto himself.
9 years after his first murder, Jeffrey Dahmer returns to the hunt. His second victim is Stephen Toomey. They meet in a gay bar and then go back to the Ambassador Hotel, where Dahmer has rented a room.
I had put some sleeping pills in his drink to render him unconscious. And was just going to spend the night with him. When I woke up in the morning, he was hanging over the side of the bed, and I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have. That's when the obsession went into full swing.
Dahmer takes Toomey's body to his grandmother's house, where he dismembers it and bags it up with the rubbish. In 1988, Dahmer photographs and fondles an underage male who escapes and runs to the police. Dahmer is convicted of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. Gerald Boyle is also his attorney in this case. What neither Boyle nor anyone else knows at the time is that while awaiting sentencing, Dahmer kills again.
He fooled his doctors, psychiatrists, judge, pre-sentence writer, probation officer, his lawyer, the prosecutor, and everyone else. Because that's what his whole life was, fooling people about his sickness.
After serving 10 months, Dahmer moves back with his grandmother. Several months later, in the spring of 1990, he moves to Oxford Apartments. From the beginning, Dahmer takes steps to safeguard his privacy, installing a fake security system, complete with camera. He also purchases a small freezer. Now feeling secure in his apartment, the pace of his killing escalates. Konarak Syntheson phone is only 14 years old when he meets Jeffrey Dahmer at the Grand Avenue Mall. The routine is the same. Dahmer offers him money to come back to his apartment. In a video statement for a civil suit filed later by the family against the city of Milwaukee, this is what Dahmer said happened next.
He was on the couch, lying down. The drilling technique had already been applied, and I thought he was asleep.
With his victim asleep, Dahmer goes for a drink in a local bar.
Did you arrive at a conclusion as to whether or not you had taken his life as a consequence of the drilling technique?
Well, it had
How do you know that?
Because he was walking down State Street.
What happened next is almost as unbelievable as the crime itself.
He was nude. Two girls had called 911 police or something. I put my arm around him, trying to walk him back to the apartment, and got halfway there, and that's when the police and rescue squad came, I think. The story he used was that he was a house guest friend who sometimes drinks too much on the weekends and runs out of the street half-dressed or naked.
Remarkably, Dahmer is able to convince police that Konarak, a slight 14-year-old boy, is his adult lover, and they return him to Dahmer's apartment. Like the police in Ohio more than a decade earlier, the Milwaukee police failed to conduct a thorough search. Had they checked the bedroom, they would have found the body of Tony Hughes, killed just 2 days earlier. The police then call their control center.
The intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend, and we're be a minute. My partner's going to get deloused at the station.
Glenda Cleveland, whose niece and daughter had called the police, calls the station later that night to check on the condition of the boy.
How old was this child?
It wasn't a child, it was an adult.
Are you sure?
Yep.
Are you positive?
It's all taken care of, ma'am.
But she is too late. 30 minutes after police had left the apartment, Konarak's Syntheson phone was dead. It will later emerge that Konarak was actually the brother of the boy Dahmer had earlier been convicted of molesting. As the body count mounts, Dahmer is losing control. When neighbors complain about the smells coming from his apartment, he claims it is from his aquarium water. Later, someone calls the police about the stench, but they go to the wrong apartment.
At the end, he was stumbling over his bodies in his house. He had multiple bodies.
He had a production problem in his disposal factory, which is he took too many victims before he'd gotten rid of the remains.
One individual he had in his bathtub packed in ice. He wanted to keep him for a few more days. He did not want to melt the ice, so he was showering standing over a dead body.
If there was anything about Jeffrey Dahmer that went out of control, it was at the very end, when during the last few victims, he drank too much, took too many victims, and let his job go to hell.
Dahmer is fired from his job in the chocolate factory just 2 weeks before his arrest, and worse, he is evicted from his reeking apartment.
He gave up when he got the eviction notice, figured he couldn't get rid of the bodies in time.
He was going to be caught, and I think he knew it, but in his case it would have been of a relief because he couldn't maintain the pace that he was experiencing with these murders, and I think he was coming to an end. It was either going to be a suicide or getting caught, and Dahmer really wasn't very suicidal.
But was Dahmer insane? Of the 17 killings, Dahmer has admitted to the murders of 15 men. Although he does not dispute the second murder, he is not charged with it because he does not remember the actual killing, only waking up with and disposing of the body. He will later face charges in Ohio for the killing of his first victim. Both sides agree Dahmer knew that the killings were wrong, but what the jury must decide is Dahmer's state of mind at the time of the murders. Was Dahmer so mentally ill he could not control his behavior, or were the killings a series of premeditated acts? Both sides will rely on doctors who examine Dahmer. The defense calls a series of experts, including Dr. Fred Berlin, who testifies that Dahmer was out of control.
Jeffrey Dahmer's diagnosis was necrophilia, What that means is he was erotically aroused by thinking about or interacting with dead bodies.
According to Berlin, the necrophilia causes Dahmer to have an irresistible urge, which ultimately makes him kill again and again.
There's something driving him to act that under certain circumstances, because of those circumstances, he can defer acting, but in my opinion, he cannot and was unable to stop entirely.
I asked Jeffrey Dahmer whether he worried about getting AIDS. He said, yeah, I used a condom. Well, the idea that he would stop in the middle of his contact with a victim to put on a condom tells me that Jeffrey Dahmer has more self-control about his sexual behavior than the average teenage boy in the backseat with his girlfriend.
Dr. Park Dietz, star witness for the prosecution, agrees that Dahmer is a necrophiliac, but he cannot agree that the necrophilia alone makes him a serial killer.
What he did have, however, was three problems that account for how he would do such horrible things. The first is sexual deviations, the second, alcoholism, and the third, a personality that was such that he really couldn't develop the kinds of appropriate human relationships that would have allowed him to fulfill his sexual desires without crime.
Serial killer or so mentally ill that he has no control. The fate of Jeffrey Dahmer now rests in the hands of the jury.
I heard things that I could never imagine that could be done to another human being by a human being. I couldn't imagine any kind of a monster thinking of doing something like that for his own pleasure.
In regard to the death of James E. Dockstader, did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? Answer, no.
In all 15 cases, the jury finds that Dahmer does not suffer from a mental disease as he kills.
Remarkably, a jury said, in effect, that a man who was having these preoccupations and urges, who was drilling the holes in the head of somebody to create a zombie, who wanted to relate intimately to a corpse, this man is a normal person. He does not have a mental disease or disorder. That really troubles me.
The man was not dumb by any means. I mean, he did research. He figured out how he could get rid of the body parts, by getting this big barrel in there and these chemicals. He thought he would get away with it.
Before sentencing, the families give so-called victim impact statements.
My name is Rita Isbell, and I'm the oldest sister of Errol Lindsay. Whatever your name is, Satan, I'm mad. This is how you act when you are out of control. I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you, mother. I hate you. This is out of control. Don't, Jeffrey, I kill you. God damn it. Look at me, motherfucker. I kill you.
Concentrate fast.
I kill you.
And now, Dahmer addresses the court.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. My attempt to help identify the remains was the best that I could do, and that was hardly anything. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know society will never be able to forgive me. I know the families of the victims will never be able to forgive me for what I have done. I am so very sorry. Your Honor, I know that you are about to sentence me. I ask for no consideration.
And he gets none, as Judge Lawrence Graham imposes sentence.
As to count 1, the court will impose a mandatory life sentence plus an additional 10 years on the habitual criminality.
Jeffrey Dahmer receives 15 life sentences and starts his life in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer is brought to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Later, he will receive his 16th life sentence for the killing of his first victim in Ohio. But even life in prison cannot stop the urges.
It never completely goes away. I'll probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I wish it would go away. I wish there was some way to completely get rid of the compulsive thoughts, the feelings. It's not nearly so bad now that there's no avenues to actually act on it. But no, it never seems to go completely away.
According to his father Lionel, he and Jeffrey continue a dialogue on the origin of man, which they'd started several years earlier. Jeffrey believes that due to his early exposure to the theory of evolution rather than creationism, his son finds it easy to murder 17 people. The reason, claims Lionel, is because Jeffrey thinks himself to be a creation of nature and not of God. And if there is no God to hold him responsible for his actions, then there is nothing to prevent him from killing.
One of the main reasons for my continuing to do the things I did for so long was because I felt that I didn't have to be accountable to anybody. I felt that I could keep it in my own secret little world, keep everything under control, and would never have to deal with the consequences. And so things just progressed from bad to worse.
Around 9 months into his sentence, his father claims Jeffrey has returned to religion.
I know that people will always think of what he did when his name is mentioned. That's true. But what I would like to temper that just a little bit. He really had sincerely become a different person who just couldn't really have any connection with what he did the last year and a half, let's say, of his life.
Minister Roy Ratcliffe meets Dahmer when he is asked to baptize him in prison.
He said, I really feel very remorseful for the crimes I've committed, and I really personally believe I should have been put to death by the state. To which I responded by saying, I agree, you should have been put to death by the state. To which he then said, well, if that's true, then am I sinning by continuing to live?
The other inmates at the prison apparently agree.
In July of '94, he was attacked by one of the inmates while he was sitting in the chapel service. And we visited him, Sherry and I visited him, and we could see the cut from the razor that had been strapped to a toothbrush.
4 months later, Jeffrey Dahmer is finally cornered. He is cleaning the bathroom in the prison gym when he's bludgeoned by another inmate, convicted murderer Christopher Scarver.
You know, I kind of anticipated he was going to be killed, and in prison, I predicted it would happen within 2 years, and it happened in 2.25 years. I'd seen him in the prison system. He got agitated that he was in solitary confinement because he didn't want to be in solitary confinement. Why he wanted to go in, if he wanted to go in the general population to be killed, I don't know. That's something he didn't discuss with me.
Dahmer is one of 2 inmates killed by Scarver that day. Because Scarver is African American and his victims are white, many believe the killings are racially motivated. Gerald Boyle is on the committee that investigates Dahmer's killing and says the killings are not motivated by race, but by Scarver's warped criminal pride.
Scarver had 5 people on his hit list, 2 of whom were Caucasians, the other 3 were Afro-Americans. Mr. Scarver didn't think these people should be entitled to the word murderers because of the people they killed. Children, wives, and the kind of people that Dahmer killed.
In his will, the man who is to become one of America's most notorious serial killers asks that his body be cremated quietly.
He did not want a funeral, and he didn't want a grave marker. And his stepmother speculated that simply meant that he felt so bad about himself, he just wanted to disappear from all time, and there'd be no traces of his existence to be found anywhere at all.
Which is exactly what his victims' families want too. The Oxford Apartments, where Dahmer had committed most of his murders, becomes a morbid tourist attraction.
people's coming by looking where Dahmer killed people, eat people, and we are sick of that. We went through enough.
The apartment building is purchased by a community group. As the victims' families look on, the building is destroyed in an attempt to erase Dahmer's legacy. Where the building once stood is now an empty lot, neglected and haunted by the grisly crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer.
The story of another serial killer next Tuesday night at the slightly later time of 10:45. Fictional horror next with Poltergeist: The Legacy after the break.